Good afternoon, to all of you in my Impressionism class. Hope you're all still healthy and dealing with these difficult circumstances reasonably well. Today I'm going to present a lecture on Renoir, Mary Cassatt, and Morisot. And this will be the last of the lectures on the Impressionism material. Subsequently we'll move to Post-Impressionism. I've grouped these three painters together because they were especially interested in the human figure. That's really very much true of Renoir. Mary Cassatt as well. Berthe Morisot a little less so. Of course, the latter two, Morisot and Cassatt, were women participants in the Impressionist exhibitions. Let's begin then with Renoir, and I'm going to go to images. Renoir was born in 1841 and died in 1919, so another long life, one of the longest lived of the Impressionists. I think only Monet lived longer. You'll remember that we talked about Renoir a little bit in our coverage of material leading up to the first Impressionist exhibition. And in Renoir's early work, we saw an interest in the human figure, painting of portraits, really throughout his lifetime, quite gifted as a portrait painter. And this is a work that I showed you previously. This is his portrait of William Sisley, who was the father of the artist Alfred Sisley. A portrait that it has a certain informality about it, as if the man was captured in movement, arm upraised, holding his glasses or pince-nez, suggesting in conversation, engagement with others in the setting. And then we also saw this work, which is called Le Pont des Arts, the Bridge of the Arts. Really quite a stunning example of his early landscape painting. And we'd have to call this work naturalist or realist. It's really a pre-impressionist work. While it shows an interest in the landscape, it's a modern scene of the activity along the river in Paris. The Bridge of the Arts, Le Pont des Arts, is the pedestrian bridge that you see here, made of cast iron. All the buildings can be identified. This is the Institute, department stores over here. It looks like people are loading or unloading from a barge, perhaps a bathhouse or a laundry house over here. But you'll notice that it's painted in what we would call local color. That is the actual seen up close colors of individual items of clothing, flags, boats, and the like. There's little sense here of reflection and refraction and the way the atmosphere obscures, alters the appearance of things, as would happen in later Impressionist works. During the 1860s and into the 1870s, Renoir was one of the most successful of the Impressionists in getting works accepted to the Salon. And this might be attributed to two reasons. He was, throughout his career, interested in the human figure. And of course, this was a primary focus of attention in conventional painting, traditional painting, as seen in history paintings and portraits. And in a work like this, he's painted his mistress, Lise Trehaut, in the guise of Diana the Huntress. And his technique here is fairly traditional. The technique here is particularly reminiscent of Courbet in his rendering of the bulky body of the model with abundant shading that gives her a sense of real substance within this large canvas. And I think I have a couple other examples. Some of these we saw earlier. This is Lee's, the same model, but now with an umbrella. It dates from 1867. This was accepted at the Salon of 1868. This is one of many works of the time that show an interest in contemporary fashion. She's dressed a la mode in the manner of the time. The handling of lighting is rather interesting here in his casting of a shadow over her face so that is obscured and becomes somewhat mysterious while the light falls strongly on her dress, giving it just all the more attention and focus within the image. In this work, I'm looking for the title here, The Engaged Couple, dates from 1868. And this was accepted in the Salon, I believe, just the following year, 1869. In this case, Renoir has used the painter Alfred Sisdy, who was a good friend, and his mistress, again, Lise Trejo, who model as a fictively engaged couple. You notice that the painting of the figures is similar, with the brushstrokes brushed out, the brushwork quite finished, the figures given firm contours. There's a switch to a different kind of brushwork in the background, fuzzy, like globs of cotton candy. It looks a bit like a theatrical backdrop. The work also shows a possible influence from something called carte de visite, visiting cards. Now these became hugely popular. There was a fad of the time called cardomania. With the advent of photography, people would have small scale photographs, and I'm showing you here a couple examples. Notice the ruler, which indicates that these are quite small in size, and these black and white carte de visite. Let me pull up the label here in case you're wondering what's spelling that. You can see it at the bottom. Show a pair of figures. They might be siblings. Cards like this then were traded among friends and family members. They were kept in albums, much in the way we might create albums of family photographs, travel photographs. And you can see that if we go back to the engaged couple, that they are posed in a way that on a large scale. Now with color, it bears a strong resemblance to the organization of figures, and here the implied interaction between them in carte de visites of the time. At the same time that Renoir was creating these large-scale figure studies, which were quite finished and more traditional in technique and design, although they certainly cast figures in a modern guise. They're a part of that interest in modernity. He was working in a more experimental vein in painting en plein air landscapes, and he did this while enjoying the companionship and probably also the leadership, the more advanced example of Monet. And here a pair of works allows us to see paintings made by Renoir on the left-hand side and by Monet on the right-hand side. And they were literally working side by side, easels set up side by side in painting La Gruyère, the froggery or the frog pond. And remember, I showed you the Monet earlier. This site was one along the Seine River, a few miles from Paris, and was one of those places where city dwellers would go, members of the middle class, lower middle class, middle of the middle class. They would go there on days when they were free from work. That was usually just Sunday. And they could enjoy the out of doors, the sunshine, the good weather, and they might engage in boating. We can see references to boats, just simply strolling and interacting. They might swim. We can see swimmers over here. They might enjoy an outdoor meal. And you can see a covered shed on the right-hand side in both cases where diners are sitting together in social company. Uh, the island I told you earlier was called the Camembert, after the cheese, because Camembert cheese was prepared and served in round shapes like the island. Um, so while the subject matter is quite literally the same, the technique is a bit different. I think Monet's technique is more advanced in his capacity to perceive the truth of the situation and give an organized arrangement to the reflections that seems to closely replicate what one actually see. The coloring seems more true to fact. Renoir's brushwork is quite different. Um, it's I would say less refined, little messier, and in his representation of the subject, it seems less truthful, more decorative. He is trying to catch up with Monet here, and this interest in simply more harmonious scene for its own sake and a more decorative scene is something that would persist in his work throughout his career. Back to Pont des Arts, and here I want to compare this with a later landscape. You're looking at Pont Neuf on the right-hand side from 1872. And this shows the development of a more impressionist technique in the work of Renoir. The realist example on the right-hand side, and here you can see that the coloring is really quite bright, especially the blues. In this case, the scene is backlit so that the buildings have a shadowy facades. The figures are casting shadows toward us. But you notice that there's the lighting is much more complex, and we're seeing everything here through veils of atmosphere that makes the colors all throughout less than pure. Renoir was an active participant and organizer of the first Impressionist exhibition, which took place, as you remember, in 1874. And he exhibited, I think, about 10 works at that time. I'll show you two of the works exhibited then. We're looking on the screen at a work called La Loge, the Box. And it's a kind of informal portrait in that it shows an attractive youngish woman. She's at the theater. Now this could be an opera, it could be a ballet performance, but notice she's holding opera glasses. They rest on the wall of the box in front of her. She's wearing what seems like fashionable attire. She looks toward us pleasantly. She's dressed to be seen, and behind her is a male figure whose glasses are aimed around the room. This might be between acts or before the opera, before the performance actually began. And so they are casting gazes about to see who else is present. At the same time, Renoir exhibited, let's see, I've got to go forward, this work, which is called The Dancer, 1874, in a lighter, gauzier kind of brushwork, a single figure seen against a blank background. This was what would recapitulate his interest in painting large-scale single figures against some kind of background that places them in a particular setting. We'll be you've already seen examples of paintings of the ballet by Degas. What a difference between the two, where Degas was really interested in movement and in the strain and stress on the body, and depicted dancers from oblique points of view, elevated points of view, often truncated by the frame or other dancers. Here, Renoir shows us in a much more traditional way, a single figure standing, posing, aware of a viewer, as opposed to absorbed in her activity. I've stuck in this figure, this work, which shows us a similar figure, painted in 1874, and it's simply called La Parisienne. So we're looking at a modern, young Parisian woman in the latest attire. It appears that her dress has a bustle. It is a kind of an elevated buttocks area, rear area, that projects upward and outward in a pronounced way. This color, this dark blue color, was considered very fashionable. And notice that she's presented in much the same way against a blank background, posing, aware of the viewer, and so different from a Degas image of the figure. Renoir was very poor throughout the 1870s. He relied on his friends for housing quite often and for advances of money to survive. He ended up essentially on the couch at his parents' house from time to time. He desperately sought to ingratiate himself to collectors. And for him, the most effective way of doing this was to paint portraits. At the second Impressionist exhibition, which took place in 1876, 12 of his 15 submissions were portraits. But he also continued to struggle with en plein air painting and the challenge of rendering a human figure in natural light. Now, the painting you see on the screen, one of his best known, which is called Le Moulin de la Galette. This was located on the hill of Montmartre, north of Paris, painted in 1876. And this was a place where one might go to, on a fine day, to dance out of doors, to enjoy social company, to eat and drink. And it's a place that attracted a lot of artists, bohemian types. It attracted members of the middle and lower class. So there was some class mixture here. This was an ambitious painting on Renoir's part. The painting is 4.5 feet by 6 feet in size. It was painted in the studio, but it's based on numerous sketches which were made on site. Renoir had friends, artist friends, modeled for some of the figures, and then assimilated these various sketches into the full view which you see here. Notice that there is no center of focus, really. A few figures stand out because they look toward us. Over here, for example, the dancing couple, or because they're larger in size. So perhaps the woman here near the center, although she does not look at us, the males on the right-hand side with whom she is interacting. There's a kind of accidental quality about this, much like Degas' L'Absent. It appears that the frame has just been held up over a random section of the crowd, and he's recorded what he sees there. And what he sees is a mixture of the various kinds of activity that takes place. But there's the clear implication that the activity extends beyond the frame on left and right. Renoir's characteristic kind of fuzzy, again, I think of cotton candy brushstroke is seen throughout here, and the way it models the light and shadow which passes through the canopy of foliage and falls on the back of the male figures on the ground over here in splotches of blue and white. It's an image that's full of pleasure. It's full of congenial social interaction. something that Renoir rendered quite easily. He was more attuned to this in his own personality than the other Impressionist painters, and I think quite a successful image. But this really marks the limit of his effort to paint figures in natural light. The third Impressionist exhibition, which took place in 1877, at that time, Renoir showed 21 works, but he sold very little, and the works that he did sell were at low prices. And so Renoir began to lose faith in the salon. And if you consult your, in the Impressionist exhibition as a means by which these painters might show their works to the public and gain some recognition and success that might further their careers, if you take a look at the handout that I distributed to you earlier on the well-known artists that participated in the Impressionist exhibitions, and this indicates which exhibitions they were a part of. You'll notice that Renoir was a participant in the first 3 exhibitions and then only one of the later 5 exhibitions. And this was because he turned away from the Impressionist organization and began to exhibit at the Salon once again. He returned in 1877 and he continued to show at the Salon regularly. In his search for patrons, Renoir was successful in meeting a number of prominent, affluent collectors, one of whom was Georges Charpentier, who was the publisher of a periodical called L'Art Moderne. And in 1878, Renoir painted this large, quite ambitious group portrait, which shows Madame Charpentier, who is well known for organizing a salon, that is a gathering place of high society, cultured people who would gather weekly to engage in discussion and social interaction at her house, at their house. And here she is shown with her 2 children. The work is 5 feet by 7 feet. Here Renoir has returned to the more conventional, the more defined style of his earlier large figure works, but using the brighter and the stronger coloring that features the figures in his Impressionist works. The figures arranged on a diagonal that stretches from lower left to upper right. We see the family dog on which one of the girls sits. The dog seems to tolerate that with little trouble. And there's what looks like a screen, Japanese screen. Perhaps it looks like the Charpentiers collected Japanese bric-a-brac, as did so many cultured people at the time, and some objects of furniture there in the background. An altogether pleasant image that seems to show the figures realistically and engagingly. This is sort of thing that Renoir was good at doing. Another one of his most famous works, which depicts the social interaction at the time. Again, we've got the human figure again and again and again in Renoir's work, either individually or in groups. This is the luncheon of the boating party, which dates from 1880 to 81. Here we see what might go on under that shed in the earlier work, La Grandelière, where some of the men are attired as if they've been boating, wearing their sleeveless t-shirts. Others are more formally dressed, top hats in the background, and they're engaged here in social interaction over food and drink in a way that seems altogether fun and pleasant, enjoyable for all. We see his brighter palette on display here. Uh, the the art dealer Durand Ruel, who bought paintings from Manet, um, a lot of them about 10 years before, and then had purchased from the Impressionists off and on as he could afford to, um, was an active purchaser of Renoir's works around 1880. And this gave Renoir, for the first time, really, resources with which to travel and to live a little bit more comfortably. In 1881, Renoir went to Italy. And um, there he went certainly to relax, to travel for that reason in part, but also to paint new places and to study the art of the past that was on display there. And when he did this, he was particularly impressed with the art of Raphael and um, and impressed by the large-scale fresco paintings that he saw in churches and palaces that would have come from the Renaissance and Baroque periods. He was amazed by the simplicity and grandeur of ancient art, and 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 the art of the great Italians, Raphael most of all. What impressed him was the structure, the clear definition, the discipline of their art. And this led him to feel a sense of crisis about his own painting. I'm reaching around here for a book. On your course calendar, you will note that I have indicated some readings, a supplemental reading by Renoir, which I will not send to you. I'm going to read a few things here, and that will substitute for you getting the reading and doing it yourself. I'm reading an excerpt from a letter that Renoir wrote from Naples to the dealer Durand Ruel in November of 1881. And what he says here is, I have been meaning to write to you for a long time, but I wanted to send you a mass of pictures as well. I'm still bogged down in experiments. I'm not satisfied, so I clean things off again and again. I think I shall have made progress, which always happens after experimenting for a long time. One always comes back to one's first love, but with a note added. Anyway, I hope you will forgive me if I don't bring you back a great deal. I'm like a child at school. The new page is always going to be neatly written, and then poof, a blot. I'm still making blots, and I am 40 years old. I went to look at the Raphaels in Rome. They are very fine, and I ought to have seen them earlier. They are full of skill and wisdom. He didn't try to do the impossible, like me, but his work is fine. I prefer Ingres for oil painting, but the frescoes are admirable in their simplicity and nobility. Seeing these works in Italy furthered in Renoir a sense of crisis, a sense of doubt in his own accomplishment as a painter. He was to say later that there he was, 40 years of age, and he felt like he couldn't draw and he couldn't paint. This sense of crisis was no doubt furthered by the lack of acceptance of his works in the Impressionist exhibition. Well, of course, they were shown, but they were badly reviewed. They weren't purchased, and that led him to go back to the salon. And now he sees some of the great work of the past, and this prompts in him a sense of doubt at his own worth. And so he sought new solutions. We're looking here at an early painting toward a new approach. One of Renoir's patrons was a man who had a country house in Normandy. Braille was his name. And Renoir visited there for extended periods of time. And on one of those visits, he painted the Children's Afternoon at Vargemont, which you see here, dating from 1884. And you'll notice that Unlike Renoir's Impressionist efforts, that the brushwork is all blended. The whole painting is made in very small, light touches, which are blended together. They appear a little less blended in the background, but more fully blended elsewhere. Um, the painting overall has a precision in its rendering, which is new in his work. He was later to call this his manière aigre, his harsh or sour manner, dry manner. So, but this is something he tried out and developed for almost a decade. The subject, which shows the domestic life of women, um, doing various things, playing with a doll, reading, sewing. These are things that women of the middle class, upper middle class typically did to occupy themselves during afternoons. And they're arranged in a way that seems natural and connects them together in a realistic way. Now, Renoir's major effort in this vein, in this manière aigre, as he was later to call it, is seen here in a painting which is called The Bathers. It dates from 1885-87. So we're looking at the female nude, which was increasingly a prominent subject in Renoir's work. In this case, however, he has based the work on a pre-existing classical work, and I'm going to show you that here. You're looking at a relief by Girardon, which dates from the 17th century, and this is on a fountain at Versailles. And you'll notice the pose of this figure right over here, or this figure over here splashing water on others. And I've got here a detail from it. These will be taken up and used with only modest variation in Renoir's painting. This work of relief sculpture, notice, has very firm outlines to the figures. The setting is indicated just rather suggestively. And the whole idea here, this is Diana is the major subject, and I think she's over here. And these then would be nymphs, followers of Diana, who are, Diana's a woodland nymph, who are bathing at this moment in the woods. Let's go back to the Renoir. All right, here's Renoir's view, which includes fewer figures, but you can see here the figure splashing water and the figure leaning back as if to protect herself, hand upraised, that are taken quite clearly from the Girardon relief. There are really a couple different techniques of brushwork evident here. That of the figure, they all have very firm contours, and they're modeled rather extensively in light and shadow. You'll notice that the body types of the figures differ. Renoir wrote a text proposing an organization of irregularists, and this is indicated on your course calendar. It's something to read. And what he says in this document, proposing a society of irregularists, is that nature is full of irregularity. No two things are ever the same in nature. And here we can see him carrying that idea to the human figure. Their hair colors are different, their ages are a little bit different, their body types are somewhat different. These two similar, but here a thinner, more lithe figure. As I said, rendered with firm, clear outlines, the background more sketchily represented, a bit more impressionistically. But impressionism in the sense of the brushwork, not in the sense of en plein air painting, or trying to capture the precise interaction of light on material objects, as Monet did. All right, moving on. In Rembrandt's later work, 1890s, he painted the female figure clothed or nude again and again, and he does this either in scenes of bathers or genre scenes, such as you see here. And a favorite subject in this regard was women at the piano. I've got a couple of versions to show you. Unlike the Caillebotte painting, where we see Caillebotte's brother quite seriously engaged in playing music, um, uh, and as I remarked earlier, the only painting I know of offhand of a male at the piano. Renoir's women are elegantly dressed and they seem less seriously engaged. And there is, as I commented earlier, a kind of implied metaphor between their attractive figures and the pleasure that that gives to the viewer, and the music that they play, the oral pleasure that that would give to the viewer. Here in this view, notice that the trim on her garment is treated as a kind of calligraphic line that appears and disappears, and then is especially animated in its path across the bottom of her dress. And here a second version. A number of these show two or more figures. And in this case, we're seeing the daughters of the painter Henri Lerolle, Yvonne and Christine, playing the piano. And notice they seem to be, again, kind of plucking out a tune. The one figure observing the other and perhaps turning pages, but doing so in a way that combines social interaction with music, and seems not particularly serious. Here a work that's both genre and a portrait image. And yet another example. This seems the least serious of them all. Notice she's plucking out a melody with one hand, holding the music with the other. And so we see here repeated references to this social convention whereby women played the piano just as they read, as they wrote letters, as they drew or knitted, sewed, as a domestic pastime diversion. It was something they could put up and put down as needs arose, the need of attending to children or supervising the running of the house in some way. And here's the last work I'm going to show you by Renoir. In his late work, he, as I said, concentrated increasingly on bathers. This is his last example of such a painting. It dates from 1918 to 19, the year of his death. Now, Renoir was beset by arthritic rheumatism in his later years, so that it was necessary to, he really couldn't even hold a brush, but the brushes had to be strapped, lashed to his hands, and then he would kind of jab at a canvas with them. Of course, by this time, he was so deeply experienced at painting that, sort of like Titian painting with his fingers, he could move paint around with great facility and get acceptable results, even though his physical state was diminished. In these late bathers, he always uses young women as models. They may be 19, 20, something like that. And we see him increasing the rotundity of their bodies, emphasizing stomachs, thighs, hips, breasts, and their heads diminish in size. So they're really somewhat misproportioned. And he seems to see the female figure as a kind of symbol of abundance and fecundity, a life-giving form, as well as a sensually pleasing form to male viewers, especially who would collect these paintings, who would most especially see these paintings, and this streak of sensuality and quite frankly chauvinism toward woman really runs through his art from beginning to end. The background is obviously not any particular place. It's a kind of generic landscape, roughly sketched with bathers in the water in the distance. All right, we're going to move on now to two woman painters. The first of those is Mary Cassatt, an American painter who lived between 1844 and 1926. Most of her career was spent in France, and so she's closely associated with the Impressionist movement. She exhibited and with the Impressionists and knew them quite closely. Her last name, just to be sure I was pronouncing it correctly, because it's one of those names, it's like, I'm trying to think of her name now, the American writer, Cather, Willa Cather. It's a kind of an odd name, and one is not sure how to say it. And so I went to the web and looked for pronunciation examples, and I found three different ones, three different voices pronouncing her name in different ways: Cassatt, Cassatt, and Cassatt. I'm going to say Cassatt. That's the way I've usually said it, and I was confirmed at least by one of those sources. She was born in the vicinity of Pittsburgh. Her father was an affluent and successful stockbroker and land speculator. But shortly after her birth in 1844, the family moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, toward the east, and then eventually to Philadelphia, where Mary started school at age 6. The Cassatt family, given their wealth, could afford to travel frequently, and they did, to Europe. They regarded travel as an important part of one's education. And Mary's own mother was a formative example for her. She was a well-read, well-educated, socially engaged woman. And by that I mean engaged in social causes. During these European travels and her schooling, Mary learned both French and German. She may have seen the International Exposition in Paris in 1855. And then at age 15, this would have been 1859, she entered the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Now at that time, 20% of the enrolled students at the Academy of the Fine Arts, and if this is in Philadelphia, were women, which is a somewhat surprising number. But few of them, probably very few, 5 or 10 at most, aspired to a career as a professional artist. Knowing something about art, having some artistic skill, was seen as a socially useful ability. And you'll remember, some of you, the article that you read, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists by Linda Nochlin, where she looks at the social conditions for the development of artistic ability. And she concludes that artistic training was available to women, but it was of a very modest kind that would enable them to find diversion during their domestic time, but not really to pursue art in a serious way, not aspire to exhibit or to establish a career as a professional. At the Pennsylvania Academy, Mary was frustrated with the patronizing treatment that she received from male teachers. Another limitation there was that female students were not allowed to study the nude model. And you recall an academic training which involved advancing from the copying of great master drawings to making studies of plaster casts, which exist in 3 dimensions, to finally sketching, painting, drawing the nude model. Well, in effect, she was denied the final stage of academic training. At some point during these years, she decided to study the old masters on her own, and she did. And then she moved to Paris in 1866 with her mother and family friends acting as chaperones. Even in Paris, she could not enter the École des Beaux-Arts, the art school, and nor could she meet with fellow painters in the cafes. That would have been socially inappropriate. And so the Louvre, where both men and women artists went to study old master paintings and to make copies of them, the Louvre served as a kind of surrogate meeting place for artists, for female artists especially. And there, Mary met Manet, and she also met Degas. She was also accepted as a student in the studio of Jean-Léon Gérôme, and you can find a painting or two by Gérôme. Young Greeks at a cockfight, I think I showed you, very much an academic classicizing painting. Your textbook also shows some examples of his painting of exotic subjects like Muslims in a mosque, something that French artists might have seen in Morocco or Tangier, which were French properties at the time. She also later studied with Thomas Couture. You recall that he had been for about 6 years Manet's teacher. In 1868, Cassatt's painting of a mandolin player was accepted at the Salon. And this was the first year, the first time at which a woman American painter's work was shown at the Salon. In 1870, then, when the Franco-Prussian War broke out, Mary returned to the United States and remained there for a couple years' time. Her father quite strongly opposed her career choice, and over a number of years, he agreed to pay her basic living expenses, but not to provide money for the pursuit of an artistic career. Mary went out to Chicago for a period of time. She made some paintings there which were lost in the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. And then she got a break when she received a commission from the Archbishop of Pittsburgh to paint copies of a couple altarpieces by Correggio, which were located in Parma. This was something that a number of young women painters did. It was something that Angelica Kauffman did, I'm remembering. And if you know of the novel, The Marble Faun by Nathaniel Hawthorne, much of which takes place in Rome, there are major figures in that story, women artists who are copyists. In the United States, there were very few great master paintings to be seen and studied. And of course, a lot of these in the 19th century were still in situ. That is, they were still in the churches, the palaces for which they were made originally. So it was a common practice for those paintings to be copied, and for the copies then to be brought back to the United States or elsewhere to be seen, to be displayed, to be studied by young artists. So the Archbishop, no doubt for some church setting, wanted copies of altarpieces by Correggio. He provided the money for Mary to return to Europe, which she did in 1872. She fulfilled the commission, but she also then traveled to Madrid and Sevilla to see, to study, to learn what she could from examples of Spanish painting. She then established residence in Paris in 1874, and she was basically to remain there for the rest of her life until 1926. She exhibited at the Salon um, quite quite regularly, most years, but felt that she was treated capriciously, as the Impressionists did during those years. You know, one year one's works would be accepted, or one or part a portion of one's submitted works were accepted, and other years they were not. So acceptance was kind of a moving target, and it was difficult to figure out what would please audiences and jurors. Mary Cassatt refused to curry favor, was bluntly outspoken in her criticism of the Salon as an institution, and as well as the art that was conventional and popular at the time. Then in 1875, she first encountered the pastels of Degas, which were then displayed in a shop window. And she said about this, "I used to go and flatten my nose against that window and absorb all I could of his art. It changed my life. I saw art then as I wanted to see it, and one might add, as she wanted to make it." A meeting with Degas occurred later, and she was invited by Degas to exhibit with the Impressionists in 1879, which she did. And again, if you take a look at the handout that I distributed, she exhibited with the Impressionists in 1880, 81, and 86, missing only the exhibition in 1882. She established a friendship with Degas. Degas was often invited to the Cassatt family home. I don't know when, but at some point, Mary's father and mother and sister came to reside in Paris with her, and so they entertained Degas on occasion. And Degas and Mary formed a fairly close professional relationship for a time. Now I'm showing you, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, on the screen, the work that she exhibited in the Impressionist exhibition of 1879, and this is entitled "Little Girl in a Blue Armchair." The painting made in 1878, and exhibited the following year in the 4th Impressionist exhibition. You'll notice the brushwork is quite freely done. The brushwork that we see in these big overstuffed blue armchairs, and even in the garment that the little girl wears. It's a novel painting in depicting a child in well, think of Renoir's painting of the afternoon at Vargemont, Children's Afternoon, where the girls are presented in a more proper way. Here, the little girl is slouched in the armchair. Her skirt rises high up on her legs. She looks bored, maybe a little irritated, frustrated by something. Mary Cassatt seems to depict children here with an understanding of the mentality of children in a way that was unusual and really novel in art at the time. The composition is asymmetrical, with the main figure on the right-hand side, and most of the painting filled with furniture and the items of the room. We seem to see the girl from the perspective of an adult who and perhaps the painter as well, looking down from her position at the easel on the girl sitting below her. Another painting that she exhibited at that Impressionist exhibition, the 4th in 1879, is this, which is entitled "Reading Le Figaro." That is the French newspaper, and you can see the letters here on the masthead of the paper. It is a genre painting on the one hand, showing a woman engaged in a common domestic activity. It's also a portrait of Mary Cassatt's mother. And remember, this was the educated, sharp, rather intellectually minded mother that Mary much admired. So she's shown in an activity that would seem characteristic of her. The head is silhouetted against the wall, behind her. And notice that there is a mirror that fills much of the background on the left-hand side, and the mirror reflects the newspaper in a way that is perhaps a little confusing, but also visually interesting. Again, the brushwork is quite loose and very painterly. Other paintings from about the same time show women in public um, situations. And here is one entitled, this is in your textbook, A Woman in a Loge from 1879. This is most likely Mary's sister Lydia, and she is sitting in the box, much like Renoir's painting La Loge, at the opera house, at the theater, a big performance venue of that kind. And what we see here, which is a bit perplexing perhaps, is the single figure filling the frame in large part. And what we see behind here is all reflected imagery. So here is the back of the woman. And then we're looking at two levels of boxes across the theater from her position. And this allows us to see other theater goers. Your textbook has quite a good discussion of the way the figure is presented. We can say that this is a portrait image in that she seems to have the specific features of an individual, but it's very much a figure in a situation. And she seems, he looks away from the viewer. She seems caught up, excitedly looking around her, perhaps aware of being seen. This may be one of the first outings of such a young person in the theater. She's wearing a dress that is quite revealing, pearls around her neck. So it seems to capture the mixture of emotions that a young woman would feel in a situation like this, looking around her, but also being seen by others. And notice that the side of her face is highlit and the front of her face is in shadow, so the lighting is rather interestingly done. And then, I don't have the title for this work. Maybe it's here available down below. In the Loge is the title that's given here. A work from about the same time. And here we see a female figure again from the side, in this case, with opera glasses, looking around her. The front of the loge sweeps around so that we have other figures in view, a little larger than in the last work. And one of them, this man right here, is looking through opera glasses, and he seems to be looking at this figure. So the painting is very much, in this case, more directly about looking and being seen. Virtually all the paintings that we've seen so far, and I'll show you just a few more, are really about woman's experience, both within a domestic situation and in public. And this is a current that runs consistently through the art of Mary Cassatt. And frankly, it's one of the refreshing things that she and Berthe Morisot, whose work we'll see later, brought to the realm of art and to Impressionist exhibitions in particular. That is a woman's experience on all different levels. Women interacting with children, women in the nursery, women engaged in various kinds of diversion within the home, but also women circulating in the social world of the theater and other public venues. Back to her interaction with Degas. As I said, the two artists worked closely for a time, And Cassatt seems to have learned a lot from Degas. He taught her printmaking techniques, and she became quite proficient at printmaking under his tutelage. Her drawing improved through interaction with him. And like Degas, she began to experiment with various materials, combining various materials in a single image. Uh, Mary Cassatt also modeled for Degas in a number of paintings, and I'm showing you one of them here. This is entitled Mary Cassatt at the Louvre. It's by Degas, and it dates from 1880. And it's thought that this is Mary's sister Lydia, who's looking at a guidebook, or at least has a guidebook held up in front of her face, as Mary leans on an umbrella and gazes at the paintings on display. Another way in which Degas used Cassatt as a model was in his paintings of the trying on of hats at a milliner's. He did a series of paintings on that subject, and she is seen in a number of those works. So I'm going to show you now a number of late works by Cassatt. And what comes up here initially is an example of a print by Cassatt, and this is entitled, as the textual information indicates, Woman Bathing, La Toilette. It dates from 1881, and the techniques here are dry point and aqua tint. Dry point involves using a metal tool to inscribe an image in a metal plate, and it's the shadowing here, the slight shadowing that is achieved with aqua tint. But you'll notice that much like Japanese prints, and Cassatt was certainly interested in those, as was Degas, there are large blank areas of single colors with no gradation, particularly in the back of the figure, where just a few lines define the contours of her body, and only very slightly a few anatomical details. One is aware here of bold patterns in the dress or robe that hangs around about her waist and in the floor carpet. This work is entitled The Boating Party, one of her most famous works. It dates from 1893. And here we see a man rowing and a woman holding a child. The point of view seems to be from another seat in the boat. So we're looking down the boat, past the male, who appears largely as this kind of silhouette, with very little detail, at the female figure. The strongly defined shapes here, the firm outlines, firm contours, I think it's a work that betrays the influence of Japanese prints. This work, however, painted in oil and not a print itself. Cassatt is well known for her really charming and intimate portrayals of mothers and children interacting. And here we have an example. This is the child's first caress, baby's first caress. And another example I've got to show you here is the child's bath from 1893. Here, a point of view that suggests the influence of Japanese art. We're looking steeply down on the figures. This may be the same, let's go back and take a look. Maybe the same robe, certainly very similar. Colors, patterns the same, the colors are a little different. But one guesses, of course, she could change the colors. This is that same garment that has a bold graphic character. It gives a bold graphic impact to the scene. And you notice some of its colors are carried into here, what may be a porcelain basin. We see the pattern of wallpaper and furniture in the background. And again, we're looking sharply down on these figures in a way that they might appear in a Japanese print. In 1904, Mary Cassatt received the Legion of Honor from the French government. Quite a striking, and impressive indication of her her success and the recognition that she achieved late in life. All right, the last painter that I'll talk to you about today is Berthe Morisot, who lived between 1841 and 1895, so a much shorter life. And I remind you that she was painted by Manet, as we see here. Berthe Morisot with a bouquet of violets. Really a beautiful painting that dates from 71 or 72. Morisot was from an upper bourgeois family, a well-off family. Her father was a prefect, a term which refers to a high-level administrator. And the Morisot family was quite socially engaged. Their home was open to visitors, to guests, once a week, and Manet was a frequent visitor. Likewise, the Morisot family attended soirees at Manet's house. It was common, as I said, for upper-class girls to receive some art instruction, so they might acquire some usefully social skills. They might make small images of family members. They might find diversion during their many hours of time within the house in that way. But again, there was no strong encouragement for them to develop social professional careers. Berthe and her sister both took private drawing lessons, and their drawing instructor introduced them to the Louvre. And so, like Mary Cassatt, Berthe Morisot went there often. She could not work there without a chaperone, and she could not enter the École des Beaux-Arts, the government-sponsored school. But as a copyist at the Louvre, Morisot met other artists, including Corot, who introduced her to plein air sketching and painting, and also to Manet. Beginning in the year 1862, Morisot exhibited at the Salon a few works, and most years she was successful in gaining admission. And then she began exhibiting with the Impressionists in 74, the first exhibition. And if you take a look at the handout again, you'll notice that she exhibited with them every single time that there was an Impressionist exhibition, except for 1879. That is 7 of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions. I'm going to show you a number of her works. And again, much like the art of Mary Cassatt, what they show to us is women's experience, women interacting with their children, domestic activity that might involve nursemaids, domestic leisure, domestic chores. This work is entitled On the Balcony. It dates from 1872. So the view here is from what I want to call the Trocadero section of Paris, that is eastern Paris, and we're looking at the dome of Les Invalides here in the distance, church steeples. But our attention is focused primarily on the figures of mother and child in the foreground, enjoying a moment of leisure. The woman attractively attired. You can see the technique is quite painterly. Here, a work entitled The Cradle. This is in your textbook from 1872. This was exhibited at the first Impressionist exhibition. And it depicts a scene that is virtually altogether absent from the art of male painters of the time. We're seeing the kind of encounters and the experiences that were particular to a woman's life. Here, a painting entitled Hanging the Laundry from 1875. Now, it might be somewhat surprising for you to learn that of all the Impressionists, Morisot's brushwork was perhaps the most free, the most sketchy. This was criticized by writers, by critics quite often, and even labeled a feminine trait. the implication that she lacked the discipline that men were expected to acquire in professional training. Um, but you could also look at this brushwork as bold, as experimental, as groundbreaking. And so here we're seeing a scene of women, domestics, women attendants, women employees hanging the laundry in a country home, the city in the distance. Bold brushwork again in this work, which is entitled The Artist's Daughter. Her name was Julie, with her nanny, dating from 1884. And finally, the bath, girl arranging her hair. I'm quite sure this is the same girl. Well, I'll take that back. The girl appears to be the same age as the nanny. I thought this might be Julie. Maybe it is the nanny who is model for this. But you'll notice here that there's a combination of more definite drawing of the figure with firm contour lines, and those seem to be applied over and around very free brushwork of the kind that is characteristic of Morisot's earlier work. A woman doing her toilet, arranging her hair, again a subject which is particular to women's activity. In every example I think I've shown you, we see a woman's world, a woman's experience, women's occupations, and that runs through the art of Berthe Morisot. All right, so this concludes our coverage of Impressionist artists. After the midterm exam, which is coming up early next week, then we'll be turning our attention to post-Impressionists, beginning with Seurat. You'll be getting from me in an email today some instructions for a meeting, which I'm tentatively going to schedule for 2 o'clock in the afternoon tomorrow. That is a live Zoom meeting, at which time you'll be able to ask whatever questions you might have about these video lectures, the readings that you've been doing. I hope you've been keeping up with that. Not very many pages to sign, but also any, you received, no you didn't. You'll be getting essay questions for the midterm exam. And we'll talk during that live meeting about what the exam will include. So look for an email on that. And that's all for now.